You know, some stories have all the makings of a Hollywood movie. We're talking staggering wealth, a divorce that turns absolutely poisonous, and then a brutal murder in one of the richest neighborhoods in America. This is the story of the Ammon affair.
Okay, so picture this. East Hampton, 2001. It's a calm autumn night. We're inside this huge, secluded mansion. But something's off. The alarm system is silent. It's been turned off. The house is completely still. Everything looks normal. But that quiet? It's hiding something terrible. Because by the next morning, what's found inside this house is going to completely shatter this perfect, peaceful community.
So, the man they find inside, that's Ted Ammon, a 52-year-old giant of Wall Street. And right away, police notice something strange. There's no sign of a break-in. This leads them to one really chilling conclusion. This wasn't a random burglary gone wrong. The killer was someone who knew him, someone he might have even let into the house. So the big question is, who did it?
To even begin to understand this murder, we've got to go back. We have to look at the marriage that was at the very heart of this whole thing. See, on the surface, Ted Ammon and his wife, Generosa, looked like the perfect golden couple. But underneath all that glitter, their story was built on a foundation that was just deeply, deeply flawed.
I mean, these two were from completely different worlds. It was like the briefcase meets the paintbrush. You had Ted, this super driven, ambitious Wall Street guy who came from a really stable, normal upbringing. And then you had Generosa, artistic, incredibly charming, but also shaped by this really volatile and tragic childhood. And those differences, the very things that maybe drew them together, would be the things that would ultimately define and, destroy their entire story.
And look, when we say Ted was successful, we're not just talking drives a nice car successful. The guy was a titan. He was a partner at KKR, Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, which is one of the most powerful private equity firms on the planet. He worked on these legendary deals, like the massive buyout of RJR Nabisco. You might have heard of it from the book Barbarians at the Gate. It was this work that created the absolutely immense fortune that would tragically become so central to why he was killed.
So, what about Generosa? Well, that fiery temperament everyone talked about, it was really forged in tragedy. I mean, she never even knew her biological father. Her mom, who was described as, let's just say, mercurial, died of cancer when Generosa was only 10 years old. 10! She was basically left to fend for herself. That kind of upbringing, it creates this deep instability that really would haunt her for the rest of her life.
And for a while, it seemed to work. They lived this incredibly glamorous life. They got married, adopted 2 beautiful kids, and built an absolute dream home. But, behind that perfect, shiny facade, those differences we talked about were starting to tear their marriage apart at the seams.
And the downward spiral? It happened fast. Okay, so they get married in 86, adopt the twins in 92. Everything seems great. But by the late 90s, things had turned toxic. They even made this last-ditch effort to save things by moving to England in 99. But that just made it worse. It fueled Generosa's paranoia. And by 2000, that was it. She filed for divorce, and it wasn't just a split. It was the start of a bitter, all-out war.
So just how bitter did it get? Well, Generosa demanded half of Ted's fortune, and she claimed it was worth over $300 million. The fight was just relentless, and her anger, it grew to this really frightening level. It got so bad that witnesses later testified she started openly telling people that Ted, that he deserved to die.
Okay, so the divorce is already a total powder keg, right? It's just waiting to explode. And then a man enters the picture who is basically going to light the fuse. He's the catalyst that takes this whole thing from a nasty legal fight to something deadly. His name was Daniel Pelosi.
So who was this guy, Daniel Pelosi? On paper, he was just an electrician Generosa hired to do some work on her townhouse. But, he was far from some simple handyman. This guy had a criminal record for assault, a history of theft, he stole thousands of dollars worth of electricity, plus serious alcohol and drug addictions. He was a dangerous guy. And in Ted's eyes, he wasn't just a new boyfriend, he was a direct threat to his family. And this just created this incredibly toxic dynamic. For Ted, this wasn't about jealousy. He was genuinely scared for his kid's safety. But for Generosa, it seems like Ted's disapproval just threw gasoline on the fire. She started flaunting the relationship, basically letting Pelosi live large off of Ted's money. It was almost like this twisted act of revenge. All right, so this brings us right back to where we started. The night of October 20th, 2001, Ted Ammon is dead, and the investigation, it immediately zeroes in on the two people who had the most to gain from his murder, Generosa and, of course, her new lover, Daniel Pelosi. The motive? It was about as simple and as staggering as it gets. Money. With Ted dead, that whole nasty divorce case was just over. Gone. Instead of fighting for a settlement, Generosa inherited his entire estate. We're talking $97 million. Just like that. And if inheriting all that money wasn't suspicious enough, what they did next certainly was. Get this, just 3 months after her husband was brutally murdered, Generosa married Daniel Pelosi. I mean, the timing was just so shocking, it put them both squarely in the crosshairs of the police investigation.
So the case against them starts to build piece by piece on some really damning testimony. A guy named Christopher Pino, an acquaintance, tells the police that he's the one who drove Pelosi to Ted's house that night. And when Pelosi came back to the car, Pino says he was covered in blood and muttered, "I think he's dead." And it gets even crazier. The testimony becomes incredibly personal. Daniel Pelosi's own father gets on the stand and tells the court that his son once asked him for advice on how to dispose of incriminating evidence. Can you imagine? And then other people came forward, testifying that Pelosi had openly bragged about killing Ted, saying he did it for Generosa. So the case sounds pretty overwhelming, right? But there was a huge problem, a giant weakness. It was all circumstantial. There was no DNA, no fingerprints. There was zero physical evidence that could actually place Pelosi at the scene of the crime. The prosecution's entire case was built on what people said they heard. The big question was that going to be enough for a conviction? So while this whole legal battle is raging, there's another tragedy quietly unfolding in the background. Generosa gets diagnosed with terminal breast cancer. And with everything up in the air, the fate of their two kids, Greg and Alexa, was just hanging in the balance. No one knew what would happen to them. And then, the final act of this story plays out, and it happens fast. Generosa dies from her cancer in 2003, and she defended Pelosi right up to the very end. At his trial in 2004, Pelosi makes this last-ditch desperate move and tries to blame the whole thing on her. But the jury, they just didn't buy it. Even without physical evidence, the witness testimony was just too powerful. They convicted him, and he was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. But what about the kids? What happened to Greg and Alexa? Well, in what you could call a final victory for their dad, custody wasn't awarded to Pelosi. It went to Ted's sister, Sandra. She promised to give them the loving and, most importantly, the stable home their father had always wanted for them. A life far, far away from all this chaos. But wait, Generosa had one last surprise up her sleeve. Turns out, before she died, her relationship with Pelosi had gone sour, mostly because he was just burning through her money. So she rewrote her will. She left him just $2 million. And the rest of it, the huge, vast majority of that $97 million estate, it went exactly where Ted would have wanted it to go, to his children. Years go by, and the children, now young adults, decide to reclaim their own story. Greg and Alexa actually co-produced a documentary. They called it 59 Middle Lane, the address of the house where their father died. It was their way of finally confronting this unbelievable tragedy and honoring the memory of the man they remembered, not as a Wall Street titan, but as the kind, generous, steady anchor of their lives. When you boil it all down, the Ammon affair is just a devastating story about greed. Ted Ammon built this incredible legacy of wealth, but you have to wonder, in the end, was that very same wealth what signed his death warrant? It really leaves you with a tough question to think about. What is any legacy really worth when it's built on a foundation of so much tragedy?